When I left religion and fundamentalist Christian churches, during 25 years in 7 churches, I experienced 4 power struggles and violence and disagreement in leadership, whether senior or junior leadership. These altercations caused all 6 churches either to split or 60% of membership leave because they couldn't agree on a new pastor or music minister. Churches need to be united because coups and power struggles either need to cease or they need to expose the lack of quality leadership. And you might say, how in the world were there so many power struggles in church? Well, you would not believe it. I've gone to 3 Baptist churches. One framed a pastor on his computer with adult pornography and got him an early retirement. By early retirement, I mean he resigned before they fired him. Then the music minister who did that, the framing part, who had no seminary degree, either a master's or a PhD, decided he wanted to become the pastor. And, well, let's just say the Constitution of the church said that 85% of existing members who had gone through extensive membership requirements, they weren't just attendees, but members, 85% had to vote yes for a pastor to be ordained in the church. There was no non-negotiables about that. 85% had to vote for this man. And trust me, there was never a woman even considered. I always think of that episode in King of the Hill where Hank Hill goes to a church and there's a female pastor. Yeah, the reaction he got was probably what you would imagine if you've grown up in fundamentalist churches where not a woman was ever in leadership unless the entire room was women or kids under 16. Another church, well, let me finish the First Baptist Church in Alaska. Turned out 85% didn't vote yes. It was 69% voted yes. So, according to the Constitution of the church, he was not able to be pastor. But that didn't stop him. He met under the radar with several deacons and elders. And 3 out of 4 of the deacons and elders voted to change the church constitution, where only a majority of 70% had to vote for it. So he decided he was going to do what we call a send the deacons and elders to every voter's house and talk with them. The talking was pretty much, how are you going to vote? Why? And they wanted a kind of consensus of who was with them and who was against them. My parents decided they were not going to vote yes. So they were against him being pastor because he had no master's or PhD in any theology or anything having to do with being a preacher. He had never preached outside of being an interim, and he was more of a teacher. His style was very much what you would expect from a high school to young adult teaching class. So he didn't instill a reliable confidence that comes from a pastor who has had at least a decade of teaching, preaching, seminary, certifications, licensure, and being and having some religious ceremony to be ordained. This music minister had a music degree. He did not have a theological degree. He had a music degree. There's a big difference. There's a difference between a preacher, a teacher, and a missionary. A missionary is kind of a combination of a teacher and a preacher. This guy had no experience as a preacher beyond barely being able to fill the shoes on an interim base when someone was out sick or had a family emergency. He did not distill confidence because he had no skills or very limited knowledge of the Bible, which made him unqualified. Very unqualified. So he should not have even been considered. I mean, if you've ever been a part of a job interview where you're not the candidate, but you're the talent acquisition team, the interviewer, the person who comes along with the hiring or the interviewer to take notes or offer support. And I have actually interviewed for 2 jobs I was not qualified for. I didn't have the experience. I had never worked in that business, that career, that customer, that part of business before. That doesn't mean I couldn't have done it. It's like having only medical and retail experience, and you go into automotive or going into a field like air conditioning. You don't have the experience. That doesn't mean you can't learn or learn on the job. But if they want someone with 3+ years of experience or to have a bachelor's degree and you only have an associate degree, you kind of wonder why you're at the interview. And most talent agents, most members, most leadership people won't even consider someone who is not qualified. And it's not a job you can learn on the job. You have to have the credentials, the licensure, the diploma. You have to be ordained. You have to be taught how to be an apologist, which are people that defend Christianity. You have to take classes on how to be a Christian counselor and how to govern a church, even though it's the deacons that are in charge. I went to Baptist churches where the pastor was in charge. And honestly, I don't care who's in charge as long as they're qualified, experienced, and they're not in it for the power. So this music minister was not experienced or qualified. We voted, and 69% instead of the 85% agreed, so he couldn't be the pastor. He rewrote the church constitution with deacons and elders, not all of them, but 2/3 of them went along with it, kind of like how Congress and the Supreme Court and some federal judges go along with Trump because they get more out of it if they have no balls. It's the same thing in churches. They went along with it. They changed the Constitution, and they tried to intimidate people they suspected wouldn't vote yes. And my parents asked the deacons to leave the house. We re-voted. With the quorum having to be 70, they got 73, which goes against the rules of the church. But if you're powerful enough, white enough, and hetero enough, you can get away with anything. I mean anything. And the pastor who was not qualified became pastor. So we had someone with a music degree being a pastor. That was weird. And 1 out of 3 members left within 9 months after that. They weren't getting fed because the person just wasn't qualified. It's kind of like being trained by somebody who this isn't their job. They don't know what they're doing. They don't know how to discern anything. They just fly on the seat of their pants. And people who are used to having a experienced, dynamic, charismatic person as pastor You feel like you're going to McDonald's when you're used to having a fine dining experience in church. And these churches split each other apart. Another one, a very, not as qualified as he should have been, but he had all of the credentials, the experience. He just wasn't the right personality or the right fit. But they hired this person at another church in Alaska. And we left that one. Then I always made a joke. Anytime we joined a church, within 2 years, the pastor left. All 7 churches this happened. It's kind of funny. And I developed what we call complex post-traumatic stress disorder from going through the emotional and psychological uncomfortable experience, just slowly having churches suck the life out of you. Even if you're not a Christian, being in a very toxic, narcissistic, unhealthy environment where people don't follow the rules or the rules are just awful, it's enough to make you not want to go to church. Looking back, before I became an atheist, or even before I left Christianity, I never looked at it as a positive experience. The first church I went to in Alaska was outside of Anchorage. I'm not going to say where, because in the small place I was in, I believe there was, for at least 20 years, it was the only Baptist church there. They've since changed their name, but I'm still not going to go there. I'm not going to say it, and I'm just not. I don't like giving particulars. We were there from like 2000 to 2007, before the music minister planted the pornography. Then we went around town to 3 other churches, not always in the city, sometimes at the small town next door. Every single time, within 2 years, sometimes within 3 months, the pastor would leave, would die, retire, move, every single time. And I do have complex PTSD from being in churches. If you equate a bad church or a power struggle in a church, like a bad marriage, it's like I've been married 7 times and gone through 7 divorces. Because leaving a church is just like divorce. The only difference is you don't get half of their equity. You do get a lot of other things. I mean, my parents have been asked to leave churches because they interpret the Bible differently, or they dare to read the New Testament. I kid you not. My father and mother were driven out of a church because they dared to say that the Old Testament was important. There were teachers and preachers that would not preach from the Old Testament in any service or Sunday school because they were adamant that the Old Testament didn't matter anymore. They would leave churches and disown members and ostracize members and families for daring to teach a class using the Old Testament. This was a Baptist church in Alaska. It was the same church that later planted the pornography. Anyways, these are the churches I've been to. And looking back at the time, I didn't see it as a toxic relationship. And leaving churches, unless it's to move for a job, it feels like a divorce, like you're being taken away. It's like you're being rescued from Jonestown. That's what it feels like. Now, as an atheist, I've been an atheist since April. I came out in October to my family. They haven't said a single word about it. That checks out. It really does. I look at it as I was given a gift. I was able to catch a glimpse of what church is really like. Why I would never recommend people to go to church, Because if you've been in Southern Baptist churches, it has the highest CSA and SA of any Protestant denomination. And it can be a real toxic environment, unhealthy, but it can also be a good experience. I think the smaller church you go to may or may not be what saves you. If you go to a mega church, you are going to compound your problems. If you go to a church that has less than 140 people in it, you're probably going to be much safer. There's going to be little happening in theory. I mean, the one with the pornography thing was 130 members, so you never know. But usually, they just don't have scandals and just the general awfulness if you're in a very, very small, old-fashioned church. I thank my lucky stars that I learned under 21 years of age, well, 24 years of age, really, that church was a club. Church was where people went to feel good about themselves, to feel like they're superior, where they could get their narcissistic, shallow needs met without reading the Bible, growing, or offering good things to other people. And I'm sure there are a lot of decent Christians out there who give back, are kind, and they enjoy giving, not because they're going to heaven, but because they enjoy life. And I did meet a few of those people in churches. I'm not going to lie and say they don't exist. But churches overall are places that people go to find and get influence, power. They want to get in the in crowd. Church is basically a high school that never ends. There's a lot of narcissism and just awful marital behavior. You would not believe how many married cis heterosexual men who were married had mistresses and separate families. Not the families at church, the people, the family he made without his wife knowing about it. The things I heard in church kitchens and in the parlor of my mother's house would curl the hairs on the back of your head. Abuse, giving their partners STIs, love nests, love children, mistresses, being gay and not telling your spouse, framing people, doing awful things, forcing people to stop going to church because you don't give enough or you don't agree with their views on something. And it's really sad. But religion has always divided people. Religion doesn't unite people. Now, families can unite. They'll think it's the religion that's not uniting them, but it's not. People like each other because they have similar tastes and interests. They like the same kind of life. They have the same kind of morals. It doesn't make you a good person. And the kind of people I found in white majority churches, whether small or mega churches, were very shallow people. They talk and they only came together to be seen and to climb up the flagpole as high as possible so they could be adored. Very narcissistic behavior. I would not be surprised if a lot of people went to church had social, psychological, and emotional problems. Many of them were undiagnosed borderlines, where it's hard to find validation within themselves, so they go elsewhere. They're afraid of being abandoned and rejected. And when pastors give you shit for looking up to them as much as they do God, and then later let you down, then they blame you for following the rules these leaders set up. These leaders create people, a scenario where you worship the pastors as much as God. And when the pastor dies, leaves, or retires, it's almost as though someone has died. And I'm not saying it's not healthy to mourn when your pastor leaves, because if he was close to you, that's fine. But it's almost like Jesus dies when these pastors leave. It's not healthy. It's extremely codependent. Very, very toxic. I've only been in one out of... Well, it wasn't any of the 7 that I went as a member. But as a visitor, there was one that just seemed nice. I would never go to any churches anymore because I don't believe in the manipulations of Christianity. But most churches run like a business. So don't be surprised if one of the businesses called the church likes kids or goes through their secretaries, or their wife finds out they've been having a 2-year affair on business trips. Sometimes they find out they're not legally married. They thought they were, but he lied because he was already married with a family. I'm not kidding. There were circumstances where churches intimidated a woman to stay with a violent, cheating, abusive piece of shit. And she divorced, left, and flipped the bird at these people. I would not recommend taking children to church. They are so vulnerable. And the doctrine and religion of Christianity sets up abusers to get a free ride. And the destination is your kids. Or staying around or being moved around where they don't get in legal trouble. There's very little accountability. I've not seen, except for one person, get the karma they really deserve. One person got karma that I'm aware of through Facebook or in person. Nobody else who made everyone's lives miserable in 7 churches ever got karma. Personally, I think their karma was having a wife and kids who hated their guts. And the music minister who blackmailed and framed a nice pastor into early retirement, he's the only one who got his karma. Half the church left. The church renamed itself and is about to go into bankruptcy. So at the end of the day, getting in power isn't enough. You have to be able to drive the car. And the church was the car. He drove it into the ground because there was nowhere else to go. He lost the most talented, interesting people in church because they didn't want to be around or in a church that had no clue what they were doing. And at the end of the day, what kind of pastor and what kind of church you're in says enough about you that I don't need to ask you any questions. What spouse do you have, what church you go to, and how your kids live tells me as much as I need to know about you. But churches, every church I went to tore itself apart or hired somebody who wasn't qualified. Churches split because their unity is a house of cards. The only unity exists because they're getting what they want. The second they don't get what they want, or they actually get